Jeff Barr recently posted his annual Prime Day by the Numbers blog, and I was immediately inundated by questions around how much did this cost? There are a few answers possible, none of which are quite correct. There's an argument that in absolute terms, the answer is zero because it's simply money transferring from one part of Amazon's balance sheet to another, but that's unsatisfying. There's the internal chargeback cost that AWS charges Amazon for services that would be subject to, at a minimum, significant discounting just due to volume, but also quite possibly modified at some foundational level. I don't actually know how it works in practice because Amazon is not an AWS bill optimization customer of mine yet. And if I did, I wouldn't be able to talk about it publicly. So let's use the only estimates that make sense here. What the on-demand cost of this would be at retail pricing posted on the AWS website, assuming it's all in US East 1. We're going to include the numbers only for the 48 hours that Prime Day ran and not include any support charges, which you would be frankly nuts not to pay for at this scale. Further, nobody at this scale would ever actually pay retail prices, but it's enough for a fun thought experiment. Let's dive into it. The By the Numbers post that Jeff wrote gives us a list of some crucial usage numbers for our calculations broken down by each AWS service, and we start with EBS. Jeff tells us that Amazon added an incremental 163 petabytes of EBS storage capacity. Given that EBS comes in many different flavors, there's a range here. If it's GP3, which is what most folks should be starting with, it would be roughly $878,000. If it's slow magnetic SC1, then it would cost $164,000. And if it's IO2 volumes, it soars to $3.4 million. In reality, it's almost certainly a mix. Further, despite Jeff telling us that it served 15.53 trillion requests and 764 petabytes of data transfer per day, there's no way to say what this cost, if anything, in terms of additional provisioned IOPS or throughput. So I'm going to mark it as zero and assume it's all GP3 volumes for simplicity. So their EBS cost was $878,003. Now, CloudTrail is tricky because AWS CloudTrail processed over 830 billion events in support of this year's Prime Day. This is tricky to calculate along a few axes because these are all management events. They were free for the first trail. Every additional management trail, which is usually configured by accident, would add another $16.6 million for this charge. If these were all data events, the cost would be $830,000. In all probability, these charges were a mix of both types of event. Let's split the difference, be extremely charitable, and assume there's only one management trail, and call it 415 billion free management events, and as a result, $415,000 for 415 billion chargeable data events, which brings our CloudTrail cost to $415,000. Now, DynamoDB is next, and that processed trillions of requests and peaked at 126 million requests per second. This is so vague as to be fodder for absolute despair, but we can reason about this a little bit. We're going to disregard storage costs and only care about the transaction volume. Let's also assume a 50% read-write split, eventual consistency model, and then we'll have to provision for that peak throughput for the whole 48 hours since auto-scaling DynamoDB is laggy at the best of times. This brings us to about $2.5 million. If you have a problem with this or think I'm being unfair, remember that I could have instead said this was all on-demand capacity instead, in which case the cost for this line item would instead be $249 million over 2 days, so count your blessings. That brings our DynamoDB cost to just a hair over $2.5 million. Next, we have Aurora, which is incredibly hard to calculate because the numbers given include 5,835 database instances running the PostgreSQL compatible and MySQL compatible editions of Aurora, and that processed 318 billion transactions, stored 2,140 terabytes of data, and transferred 836 terabytes of data. Oh boy. Let's assume 2,000 MySQL instances and 3,835 PostgreSQL instances purely because PostgreSQL is incredibly fun to say. We're going to assume that these are the I/O optimized option because calculating out how Aurora accounts for I/O charges is incredibly frustrating, and that they aren't using either of the Aurora serverless offerings for obvious, incredibly expensive reasons. Instance sizing is tricky, but it's also everything to this calculation, because RDS instances can each cost as much as $19,000 a month or as little as $90. So let's pick something middle of the road. the DB.R6I.12X large, which comes in at $7,000 for a full month. Smack these two groups together, and the MySQL instances cost just under $2.5 million, while the PostgreSQL instances cost a bit over $3.5 million, bringing the total for those 48 hours to $6,094,000. Next up is SES. Now, the only data available in this post states that SES sent 56% more emails than last year, full stop. However, Amazon separately stated that customers purchased 375 million items. While I could snidely suggest that each sale generated 40 emails, a quick check of my own purchase history indicates that every order for me spits out 3 emails: a confirmation, a shipment notification, and a delivery notification. While many orders were obviously multiple items, we're going to balance this out by ignoring all of the promotional email around Prime Day deals. That means that we'll say that SES sent customers 1.125 billion emails for Prime Day, and we're going to assume that each one is 20 kilobytes. They talk about deliverability rates, which means they're using SES's rather snazzy deliverability manager, and that brings the cost of these billion-plus emails all in to a bit under $200,000, or $193,824.84. Next up is CloudFront. Amazon CloudFront handled a total of over 1 trillion HTTP requests during Prime Day. This is not strictly accurate. I pay attention to these things, and I can assure you that every connection as part of the shopping process is in fact HTTPS. In fact, Amazon.com is on the HSTS preload list, which means that browsers will actively refuse to connect to that domain over HTTP. Why is this important? Because the public pricing for CloudFront shows that HTTPS requests cost more. Curiously, the AWS pricing calculator does not draw a distinction here at the time of this recording. Also, CloudFront pricing varies depending upon where the user is requesting the data from, which makes accurate numbers impossible here. Let's be incredibly generous to Amazon and pretend that all of this traffic came from the US and Mexico, as those are the cheapest rates. Jeff declines to state how much data was transferred, so we'll have to guess wildly here. Let's assume 100 kilobytes per request, which comes out to 90 petabytes. Requests plus data egress means that CloudFront costs a bit under $3 million for those 48 hours, or $2,928,000. So SQS, or Squiz, processed a peak of 86 million messages a second, end of data. Okay, that's a bit open-ended, isn't it? Each second at that rate cost $34, and thus, if it were sustained, it would have cost over $5.8 million for that whole 48 hours. What makes this extra fun is that the AWS pricing calculator refuses to accept that this scale is possible. Their form yells at you 2 orders of magnitude before you get to this number. This suggests that there's a lack of scale imagination happening somewhere. As a result, I'm left to use the first tool in the Cloud Economist toolbox, arithmetic. Let's round this to $2 million. I find that more than fair. Next up is Pinpoint, which sent tens of millions of SMS messages. Okay, let's assume 50 million, all to US numbers. The cost for that is $0.00581 per message. So blowing up your phone is just straight arithmetic. Note that the AWS pricing calculator directs you to an SMS pricing tool that is simply a table. This is a poor experience. Arithmetic tells me that Pinpoint SMS costs $290,000. Finally, we come to EC2. The assertion that Amazon used tens of millions of normalized AWS Graviton-based EC2 instances is not only vague, but a problem. The idea of normalized instance hours may make sense internally at Amazon, but I can borderline promise that it doesn't make as much sense as you might hope for reasoning about your cloud costs. I will no doubt rant about this at a future date. Okay, let's assume 50 million normalized instances, which we'll call C7G.medium since it's directionally accurate. We'll have to use arithmetic here since the AWS pricing calculator refuses to believe that more than 50,000 EC2 instances are possible within a single region. Oh, honey, I have some of our mutual customers to introduce you to, which means that for those 48 hours, we'll do simple math. And EC2 costs $87,120,000 for those 2 days. Now, the total cost of Prime Day for 2023 means that if you add all of these, again, inaccurate numbers together, demonstrates that at retail pricing, running the infrastructure for Amazon Prime Day for 48 hours would cost you $102,424,943.84. Now, While this is obviously way higher than reality, assume for a minute that it isn't. $102 million in infrastructure spend for an event that brought in over $12.7 billion in sales isn't the worst return on investment that companies could make by a landslide.